All right, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Hello and welcome to the workshop, Economic Opportunities from Offshore Wind Power, Supply Chain Development in Europe and Australia. My name is Emma Aisbert and I'm a Fellow at the School of Regulation and Global Governance. I'm also Associate Director Research for the Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific Grand Challenge here at the Australian National University. I'd like to begin this evening by paying my respects to the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land from which I am speaking to you today. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present. I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance today. Let me also thank the European Union's strategic partnerships for the implementation of the Paris Agreement program for supporting today's event, with the EU and BMU as co-financing entities, while noting the opinions expressed are the responsibility of the speakers and of course do not necessarily reflect the views of the European Union. We have an excellent lineup of presenters and panelists who will be sharing their thoughts with us in this event. First, we're joined by Llewelyn Hughes. Llewelyn is Associate Professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. He also assists companies and non-government organisations in renewables and environmental sectors to navigate policy and regulatory issues with a key focus on offshore wind in the Asia Pacific. Next, we will hear from Mr. Iván Pineda. Iván is Director of Public Affairs for WindEurope. Iván started as a technical advisor on wind power integration into electricity grids and markets for WindEurope. He is a member of the IEA Wind Task 25 on design and operation of power systems with large amounts of wind power. We will then hear from Mr. Andy Evans. Andy is co-founder and Chief Executive Officer of Oceanex Energy, a developer of large-scale offshore wind energy projects located off the coast of Australia and associated land-based infrastructure. Prior to co-founding Oceanex Energy, he was one of the co-founders of an inaugural CEO of the Star of the South, Australia's first proposed offshore wind farm, with a proposed capacity of approximately 2,000 megawatts, located off the south coast of Gippsland, Victoria. Andy played a key role in supporting the development of Australia's first onshore wind farm, which will lead to the inception of a Commonwealth regulatory framework for the development, construction and operation of offshore clean energy infrastructure in Australia, planned to commence in 2021. We have asked each of our presenters today to speak for 15 minutes. That will leave us for 15 minutes for questions from the audience. Audience members can submit questions at any time in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom window. Also, I note here that for the benefit of those who can't join us live for this workshop, the presentations are being recorded and will be made publicly available. However, to encourage free discussion, the Q&A session will not be recorded. All right, thanks a lot, and over to you, Llewelyn.
Great, thanks, Emma, and welcome to everyone. I'm speaking to you for the land of the Wurundjeri people down here in Victoria, so let me also pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. It's really terrific to have the opportunity to welcome everybody to our second event in the speaker program focused on offshore wind, and also to welcome Iván Pineda from WindEurope and Andy Evans from Oceanex to today's event. We're obviously at a very interesting moment in terms of the development of the offshore wind industry, not only in Australia with the recent passing of our national framework legislation, but also within the Asia-Pacific region in general. As we know, Europe has really led the development of the industry globally, but if you look at what the Global Wind Energy Council projects is likely to happen in the coming years, the development of significant capacity is likely to shift increasingly in relative terms from the European to the Asia-Pacific market, reaching about 42% or so of total global installations by 2025. Now, that's obviously dominated within the Asia-Pacific by the People's Republic of China, with roughly 50 gigawatts of expected capacity coming in by the middle of the decade. But there are also some very significant other markets which are also working hard to develop an offshore industry. That includes Taiwan with 10 plus gigawatts, South Korea, Japan, and Vietnam as well. And now that Australia has got some framework legislation in place to help develop the sector and give certainty to developers, then Australia is now joining that group. It raises a key set of questions that we are going to focus on today, which is around industry development within Australia, but also regionally. WoodMac, for example, has estimated that the supply chain associated with offshore turbines is going to represent about $200 billion of investment opportunity globally over the next decade in cumulative terms. And in Asia, that raises real questions about the scope for the localization of supply chains within those markets, and also potentially the supply of components regionally within Asian markets. And there's also obviously, significant differences in the technology platform between floating and fixed bottom technologies. And so things are likely to look quite different between each of those. So what we're going to focus on today is a discussion of supply chain developments for the offshore sector. First of all, we'll hear from Iván Pineda, who is of WindEurope, to understand how supply chain development has occurred within the European market. WindEurope's really the voice of the industry within the European market. It's got more than 400 members from really across the whole value chain, from OEMs to component suppliers, to utilities and developers, financial institutions and associations as well. So Iván is really perfectly placed to discuss with us today how supply chain development has worked in the lead European market, and most importantly, what good public policy looks like in the support of supply chain development for offshore wind. Secondly, we're going to hear from Andy Evans, who many of you may know is a real pioneer of the Australian offshore wind industry. And that's the work he's leading with Oceanex about what Australia can do to take advantage of the opportunities within offshore. In fact, just before coming online now, we were speaking about Australia's particular opportunity potentially regionally within the floating offshore technology space. So just three very quick points before I finish with these quick introductory remarks. Just to note, firstly, that for those of you who are participating today, one of the things that we know is that offshore, has got scale and it has high capacity factors. But we also know that in many markets that it continues to need to fall in prices in order to be competitive with legacy fossil fuel technologies, and also to compete against other renewable energy technologies as well. And so one of the things that we're doing as part of our research is what's called an expert elicitation survey. Essentially, we're going to ask you what your expectations are for levelized costs of electricity across different Asia-Pacific markets, and also which policies you think are needed in those markets in order to help drive costs down and help scale up. So you'll receive an email, and of course, if you don't think if you don't focus on the Asia-Pacific markets, that's fine, but you're absolutely welcome to participate in that. The second point is that if you're interested in hearing about the first seminar that we held, where we focused on renewable energy zones or industry clusters for offshore wind, hearing from the Port of Cuxhaven and also from the Norwegian offshore cluster, then I'd welcome you to go to the ANU's website of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. And you can find that event up there recorded through YouTube, so you can take a look at that and think about a different component of the supply chain. And then thirdly, let me also just note that in February of next year, we'll be doing a deeper dive into market developments within the Asia-Pacific region through a third seminar, looking particularly at legal and regulatory aspects of market development in a number of key markets. So look out for that invitation within your inboxes. I think I'll leave it there, and I've got a few things I could say about Japan's alternative strategy for offshore market development, but I'll stop now and pass things over back to Emma for the other speakers. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Llewelyn. Our next speaker is Mr. Pineda. Take it away. Thanks, Iván.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I hope that you can hear me and see me well. Lovely, that's great. My name is Iván Pineda. I am the Director for Public Affairs in WindEurope. I've been invited, and I am very delighted to speak to all of you today about some of the experiences that we had in Europe over the last 30 years of development of this industry that obviously started as a very early niche technology. It's been evolving, and now it's becoming a whole industry with a lot of employment and significant contribution to the European economy. I will take you through some of our lessons learned, some of the things that we think are important for markets, emerging markets such as Australia and other markets in Asia Pacific, to bear in mind when you are starting the journey of these highly potential offshore wind resources that you have. Now, let me start with some numbers and figures. Europe today has 26 gigawatts of offshore wind. Those provide 3% of the electricity that Europeans utilize. That is about 5,500 turbines that are spread mostly in the North Seas. And this is important to highlight because people normally understand the North Sea, but we have also the Irish Sea and the Baltic Sea that have some of the wind farms also installed to a less extent, but those areas will become more and more important. And crucially, we are now seeing developments in the Atlantic Sea, and in the near future, we are also hoping for the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea also to become areas for offshore wind. There are 12 countries that today in Europe have offshore wind, but as we will see in the next slides, the economic benefits and the supply chain do not only restrain to those countries that have sea basin borders. And why is that? Because the European wind supply chain basically is spread across all the continent with all the countries, and that even includes landlocked countries. It's not only the local supply chain for offshore wind that you can develop like in places that have access to sea, like ports or shipyards, but it's also all the manufacturing that goes with it. A very good example is a few years ago, Poland, that now is one of the emerging markets with big plants in offshore wind, used to produce a very big quantity of the foundations and towers and steel works for offshore wind. So a country with no offshore wind installed already being part of the supply chain. So this is a message for all those markets that are starting. Yes, the industry will start develop around the coastal areas, but there will be further opportunities inland or around, and even for trade with neighbors that will spread the supply chain. There are 248 manufacturing facilities in Europe today, and most of them are serving onshore wind. And I must say that you will see the development of the combined capacity of onshore and offshore wind manufacturing as you go along in developing both the industry. There will be certain specialization, obviously, for offshore wind services and for certain offshore wind components, But apart from that, you will find that engineering companies, steel works, foundries, etc., they will be able to support both industry. Even further, with the advent of floating offshore wind, also you will see how manufacturing facilities will be able to adapt as they move into this other segment. One of the greatest successes that we have seen in the massive deployment of offshore wind is the cost reduction, the dramatic cost reduction that we have seen. Today, offshore wind is 75% cheaper in terms of strike prices. I must point out to the axis of this chart, this is not LCOE, these are strike prices as they are recorded in auctions. And you can see that since 2014, those prices have significantly come down. We are receiving results even from last week, biggest offshore auction in Denmark, that you have multiple developers bidding for the lowest possible strike price in the auction at the highest capacity. It's such the competition that we are having today in offshore wind that specifically in Denmark for this auction that is going to be announced actually 1st of December, it will be decided by a draw. So you can imagine the level of competition that we are seeing, and that is driving a lot of the cost reductions in the industry. And we are very hopeful because offshore wind capacity will increase according to the plans of the EU 4 times in the next 10 years. So to 2030, from those 26 gigawatts that we have today, we're expecting around 114 gigawatts even to go install across the entire continent. So why we are doing offshore wind and why we think this is a very good industry to develop? Well, the contribution not only for offshore wind, but this is combined. Apologies, this is only offshore wind, is 7.5 billion euros of the EU GDP contribution. So in layman terms, what it means is that every offshore wind turbine on average, obviously on average, contributes around 15 million euros to the economy. And that is spread across all the services, construction, manufacturing, operation and maintenance, and decommissioning. So if you spread all the GDP contribution across the entire life cycle of a wind farm, each of its offshore wind turbines on average will be giving to the economy 15 million euros. There are 77,000 people working in offshore wind in Europe today, and with the expansion that we are foreseeing for 2030, we believe that we can get up to 200,000 jobs in the next 10 years. How there will be spread? Well, we have most of the works, most of the jobs being developed in manufacturing, obviously because of the high labor intensity that some of the elements of offshore wind require. But also when you look at installation and operation and maintenance, you see a big number of jobs being created. Now, it is very important to understand that for each project that you are adding, obviously you are not going to add all the same jobs twice. As economies of scale and deployment goes further, obviously your engineers, your workers become more and more productive. There is a learning curve that is intrinsic to all industries. So the growth of jobs is not linear. And we have seen this in several studies across several institutions in which obviously the very early stages of job creation are very big, and there is a very good rationale to go and pursue them. But as you go along and the industry matures, those increases in jobs obviously will be more related to the labor improvements that you will have in the industry. In the case of Europe, for example, most of the new projects that we are going to add will support a lot of the works that already exist. So you see between 26 gigawatts and 77,000 jobs, and 114 and 200,000 is just only double the number of jobs, a little bit more double the number of jobs, almost triple, but 4 times the capacity. So there is some improvements to be made there. Why is that? Well, we have today a dedicated offshore wind supply chain. So over all these 3 decades, the industry has specialized and has provided now all the services that are really focused on delivering offshore wind farms in an industry that has become more standardized, that has executed projects 120 times already, and that it becomes more and more lean. What is important to understand here is there are obviously cooperation and good opportunities for other industries that are already active in the offshore spectrum. I'm talking about not only oil and gas, but I'm talking even about sand extraction for those countries that actually have it, telecommunication cable laying in the seabed, etc. So vessels, ports, and constructions at sea or offshore platforms, for example, are very well placed to make a change and to drive and to pivot towards offshore wind. It is important, however, to understand that as we go in the specialization, yes, there will be certain aspects that will be very much catered for offshore wind. And for example, there is a old and well understood paradigm that, for example, workers of oil and gas are very well suited to do the pivoting and transition to offshore wind. That is absolutely right, because you have those workers have the right skills, have the right mentality. However, there will be certain differences, and there will be specific training. There will be specific aspects that need to be done in order to get those workers fully suitable for offshore wind. Now, why offshore wind makes sense in Australia, and I hope that we are going to see this in many occasions, and this is extremely encouraging. When I saw it the first time, it really spells out the compelling potential that you have in Australia for the capacity factors. You have all the elements that is needed. You have the sea, you have the wind, and you have the infrastructure that is needed. So it is important that you take that as a basis, expand it and potentialize it so that the expansion of offshore wind is secure, particularly as you move towards decarbonization, which is going to be the, we hope, the driving force of changing the economic model for energy production in all the countries, because it's absolutely needed that we decrease the emissions, and energy accounts for 3/4 of those emissions if you want to decarbonize. So there are 7 things that I wanted to recommend in terms of learnings, and that I hope that these will be reflected in our discussions. And I hope that also as we move with the discussion with policymakers and Australia moves further down the road in developing offshore wind, those are taken into account. The first one is you need to put offshore wind in your energy plans. A very good learning that we had in Europe is that countries made ambitious plans and they put them in strategic plans and in regulatory frameworks, which we will see in a minute. In the EU, the European Commission has pledged to increase the capacity of offshore wind by 60 gigawatts in 2030 and up to 300 gigawatts by 2050. These are numbers that do not include countries outside the EU. As you may imagine, we need to add here the United Kingdom, that by 2030 wants another 40 gigawatts on its own, and Norway, that we think that has a potential of above 35 gigawatts by 2050. So all in all, we will be seeing that countries and organizations that are responsible for government and legislation, they are putting offshore wind in their energy plans. Extremely important. Number two, you need to make available offshore wind in all regions. And offshore wind now is becoming a whole European story, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, because now we are seeing developments across all sea basins. And this is important given the availability and the variety of seabed and offshore wind resources that you will have. Truly making offshore wind a regional, country-wide industry will help you to pool resources in a much more cost-effective way, and also to coordinate policies and to coordinate support for the industry when it's needed. You will reap the benefits of having a much more coordinated industry that is able to cooperate across all the different regions where you want to deploy. Number three, and I mentioned this and I alluded this early, you need to set a regulatory framework specifically for offshore. This is a picture of the Bundestag that actually Germany has a separate law for offshore wind in addition to the renewables energy law. It's extremely important that for offshore wind, there is a clarity in the legal framework in terms of access to the sea space, that there is a maritime special plan, that there is clear demarcation of responsibility between regional, state, or country or national authorities, who is doing what, who is in charge of permitting, who is in charge of site surveys, who is going to be in charge of grid development, who is going to be in charge of coordinated environmental impact assessments that will go far beyond the location where you are going to implement offshore wind. So some of the learnings that we had is that that regulatory framework at country level also needs to have a certain coordination with the neighbors. Extremely important that whenever that regulatory framework is set, your constituents, the neighboring regions, neighboring states are able to fit in. In the case of obviously a national law, it's extremely important that that law is as clear as possible between the demarcation of responsibilities between provinces, states, or regions, and the federal government. Number three, you need to identify and consult all your stakeholders as early as possible in the process of developing your parks. And obviously, this is something that you're already doing with some of the most advanced projects that you have. Very important to bring on board not only fisheries and fishermen, but also aquaculture in the case of oil and gas, shipping routes, defense. Some of the most important stakeholders that you will need to deal and that we have learned to speak and to negotiate is the ministries of defense, particularly in areas that are prone to geopolitical conflicts. I'm thinking here, for example, certain areas in the Mediterranean. Whenever the Greek government and the Cypriot government are looking into developing the regulatory framework, they need to obviously involve their ministries of defense. It's very, very important. It is going to be one of your most important stakeholders. Now, you also need to set a timetable to running auctions. Visibility is of utmost importance. And this is an example from France. We have learned across the years that it's not only enough to announce one project, for big as it might be in the time horizon. There needs to be a pipeline of projects, and there needs to be a pipeline of auctions and plans that the government sets out clearly in the future. With the years where these auctions are going to be run, the amount of capacity, even in this case, in the French case, setting a ceiling price, the maximum price, so that will give industry the signal to us to where the cost reductions and where the improvements need to happen. With enough time in anticipation and with enough planning and stakeholder consultation, industry will be able to deliver on the volumes and the costs that are needed, but it will require visibility. Now, when it comes to permitting the projects, one of the key learnings in Europe and one of the best practices is that projects go faster, cheaper, and with less risk when you have a single point of contact in government. A one-stop shop is how we call it, where developers can go and do all the administrative procedures that are required to bring their project to fruition, from environmental surveys to site and seabed surveys. Where do they need to apply for the grid connection permit? Where do they need to go in case of participating in an auction? A one-stop shop authority. It could be an agency, it could be a fit-for-purpose organization that is created by the government. But in the case of the Netherlands, this has provided a very clear path for developers to go and have the projects to be permitting, to be auctioned, and to be developed. And this is the case of the actually the Enterprise and Innovation Agency in the Netherlands. The next one is, it's very important that as you develop the grid, there is a coordination between that development in the national infrastructure plan for the entire grid. Onshore and offshore grids, they need to be planned together. It's extremely important, and I know that some countries will say, but we have all the demand close to the coastline, so we don't need to transport anymore the electricity further inland. It's extremely important that despite that, there is a very good system for evacuating the grid. With those ones, I want to finish and I want to conclude my presentation. I want to thank you very much for your time and patience, and I am open to any questions that you might have. Thank you.
An excellent and informative presentation, Iván. Our next speaker is Andy Evans. Take it away. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks, Iván, as well, for bringing real experience to what we're seeking to do here in Australia. I'll just share my screen. And really like to commend Llewelyn and Emma for getting their timing so right. It's obviously been a very large week in Australia last week for offshore wind. So I dare say this is the first webinar or conference post the introduction of the new legislation, and also the Victorian government grants as well supporting offshore wind for $40 million. So the timing is right for everyone. And hopefully what I can seek to convey today is some of the material things we're certainly trying to do at Oceanex. And it'll tie in very much to a lot of the lessons we've learned over a number of years that Iván and team have been developing. Going through the presentation today, one thing I just really want to point out, and you will have seen it in Iván's presentation, just on this cover slide here is a prime example of the main sort of floating foundation, or most developed foundation, which is the Principal Power Windfloat 1. This is a mock-up from many months ago, just prior to Kincardine, a 9-turbine project off the coast of Scotland being commissioned. So it gives a good example and insight into what a floating foundation may look like. Now, there are a number of different technologies out there at the moment. There are 3 main types, and there's probably about 20 designers out there at the moment looking at different formats of floating foundations. So when we do get to the back end of the 2020s, this is potentially what the foundations may look like. Just working through some of the background. Look, I've just been through the list of participants. It's good to see a number of very familiar faces who I've seen over a number of years. By background, as Llewelyn and Emma pointed out earlier, I've spent almost 9 years of my life trying to get offshore wind up in Australia. So that's why last week was such a big week. But certainly I cut my teeth on the Star of the South project with my co-founder, Peter Scott-Ellis. So we're still involved as shareholders at the Star of the South. So have a really active watch on Victoria. But most of what we'll get through today will be more in relation to New South Wales. I'll touch on New Zealand as well as part of being the regional opportunity. I think it's really important it's come through with what Iván presented and Llewelyn spoke to. Look, it had been challenging with a one project country with Star of the South. We managed to do fairly well in terms of getting some sort of notoriety out there. But when it comes to supply chain, it's really about getting a number of different projects of scale out there. So certainly the focus of Oceanex and industry, particularly in the next 2 years, will be about materialising some of the projects and getting some more meat on the bones on what we're actually doing, and engaging even more with the global supply chain, whilst also trying to create fantastic local content opportunities here. In terms of what Oceanex are looking at, we're looking at 5 main priority projects off the coast of Australia. All the New South Wales projects on the right there from Newcastle down to Eden, will all be floating foundation projects. As has been noted, floating foundation is usually deployed where there are water depths of over 50 metres. Most of these sites are into the many hundreds of metres, so we'll all be floating foundations. We're still a good way off choosing this particular technology, but one thing that's not in doubt is that we will be using floating foundations. Bunbury will be a fixed foundation project, so sub 50 metres water depth. And in New Zealand, looking at one of the projects being floating foundations, which will probably be what we call Taranaki A. So New Zealand is still a fair way behind for us personally as a company in terms of how much work we've done. I dare say, having spoken at one of their main conferences last week, there's a real opportunity for New Zealand, I think, having less of a hold up in terms of ideology around energy, if I've said that diplomatically enough, to really accelerate a regulatory framework and adopting it, particularly with a much smaller population that's already beyond a 90% renewables penetration. So we're looking very actively at New Zealand, albeit we are a bit further behind in terms of feasibility studies. In terms of the projects we're looking at, and this is purely to give context to the supply chain opportunities for Australia, we're looking at very large projects, so 2,000 megawatts for each of the projects. We're looking at area spaces we refer to there are licence areas, so it will certainly be a lot more condensed, but to give some sort of context, that's the size of licence area that we've got for Star of the South. So when feasibility licences are made available for application, it will be a much larger area that is put out to the public to seek applications for, but we'd expect most of the sizes to be granted a licence for would be around 500 square kilometres. A key selling point for us is really trying to minimise some of the visual issues. Obviously in Australia, onshore wind has a number of issues around community acceptance based on visuals. I used to, in a previous life, be General Counsel for Acciona almost 20 years ago. So it was always a common issue, even in the early days of onshore wind. Whilst we are very supportive of onshore wind, we do see the potential still for a number of community issues arising, particularly going to areas that are more agriculturally based, such as New England and the like. There will be some challenges around community acceptance. So we are seeking to put projects 20 kilometres plus from the coastline. There will still be a great deal of visibility at 20 kilometres. So for us, that's sort of the baseline in going out and trying to get further out, obviously trying to manage economies of scale and cost. Obviously, the further out you go, the more expensive it gets. One of the great supply chain opportunities, particularly for New South Wales, is given the two key deep water ports we've got on the east coast. Newcastle Port is a fantastic deep water port, certainly suitable for construction with water depths and drafts well beyond 10 metres, so it could accept a lot of the construction vessels. The key issue that we will have in Australia will be around land availability at the port. That's a key challenge for any supply chain. Where possible, to encourage local content, you want to be able to access vast tracts of land so you can do a lot of the construction and assembly if it makes economic sense. Port Kembla, also a very deep water port, but a bit more constrained by less available land immediately in the vicinity of the port and the outer harbour. So a really good start for Australia there, particularly the New South Wales projects. I'll speak less around Bunbury. That's more a project we're looking into the 2030s tied to retirement of the local coal-fired power station near Bunbury, but it's certainly a key market for us going forward. The dates we've got there, I'll always hazard it with the indicative figures and dates only, but certainly it will be a sprint to get to commencement dates of 2028. If we're looking at feasibility licenses being granted, I think realistically it'll be mid to late next year. Gippsland certainly should be the first area where there'll be a feasibility licence and a declaration zone for Star of the South and other projects down that way. I think New South Wales, and we're working really closely with Angus Taylor, has been very good to deal with for the offshore wind industry for a number of years, but also working with DISA, the relevant government department. Our key focus is really getting Newcastle and the Illawarra regions on the map to have zones declared as soon as possible. We'd envisage a 5 to 7 year development period to get to FID, again, based on global experience. That is fairly tight, but we certainly feel there's some real impetus now in Australia to get things moving. New Zealand, as I mentioned earlier, more in the pre-feasibility stage rather than feasibility. But again, similar sort of timelines, because we believe once a framework is in place, and it was tabled by the Minister for Energy last week at the forum I spoke at, that there's likely to be a draft regulatory framework middle of next year. We think New Zealand can move really quickly as well. Getting into some of the economic numbers, again, Iván will have seen a number of these globally. We're hoping to bring a number of these down, but when we do look at the total projects for Australia, we think the spend will be very large. Excuse me. About 40 billion Australian dollars across our whole portfolio of Oceanex projects, between 9 and 10,000 megawatts. The amounts of direct jobs should be very large as well, about 3,000 plus. Local content is very variable. Certainly the big sell on floating foundations, given the amount of subcomponentry that can be used, and the fact that there are more floating foundation designers rather than OEMs, lends itself to an innovation and localization opportunity. We certainly expect local content to be very large. We've done our utmost working with governments not to seek to encourage mandates around local content. I think it's a focus of every developer to seek to use as much local content as possible. But the reality is, in Australia being a new region, without a lot of these skill sets, is that there will be a great importation of global skill sets and global supply chain. One thing I'll touch on a little bit later is Oceanex kicked off a large supply chain only 3 months ago, which we expect to be finished by the end of February next year. So we're really seeking to bring together the local opportunities and mix it in with the global opportunities. We've obviously got a great steel manufacturer here at BlueScope. They won't be able to cover all the requirements because there's a lot of steel involved. One key area we need to improve on is steel fabricators. There's been a real dearth of that with the closure of a number of businesses in Australia, whether it's automotive or shipbuilding. So steel fabrication is certainly a supply chain challenge in Australia that we need to look at going forward. New Zealand, again, it's more a prorated number back down based on the size of projects over in New Zealand. But again, very similar. I suppose the New Zealand opportunity is a transitioning offshore oil and gas industry, particularly around Taranaki, with vetoes on newer offshore drilling licenses over the last 2 years. So, I mean, I think there is a real desire to really transform a lot of existing supply chain opportunities. I won't go too much into the big sell of offshore wind. I think it's gradually getting out there at the moment. But certainly for us, big sell points around supply chain skill sets we've got. Around Newcastle and the Hunter Valley, obviously renowned for coal mining, power generation, fantastic deep water port, dealing with import and export. Same down at Port Kembla as well. And adding on top of that, Port Kembla with the steelworks at BlueScope. Also, Andrew Forrest has been very entrepreneurial down there with AIE and AIP, with gas importation and power generation. So we have got regions that are very active with almost 100 years of skill sets. Probably the key thing I want to point out as part of the differentiator for what we do with Oceanex with our projects, and even going back to Star of the South when we founded that, a lot of the opportunity really derives from the closure of, or forecast closure of coal-fired power generators. It really unlocks a lot of the transmission opportunities. So we do support the build out of transmission with the renewable energy zones, but one of the key sell points around offshore wind and why we think it'll be such a big factor in the energy mix over the next 5+ years is the fact that with the closure of coal-fired power stations, you can then inject new electricity generation from offshore winds that are located in a proximate location. So certainly that's been a key criteria around where we design and site our locations. I'm wary of time. I won't go through the real why offshore wind, other than to sum it up in my elevator pitch, which is around Australia having 85% of its population located within 50 kilometres of the coastline. Most of our grid is based around coal, which is within 100 kilometres of the coastline. So you have your wind resource close to your market and your means of getting into the market, all within around about 100 to 150 kilometres. So it certainly makes sense from that perspective. Supply chain, again, this is really just a really small snapshot of some of the opportunities. Iván will have reams of information. We've certainly got a lot more on our new website, but it cuts across a number of the different areas. And I think very different to a number of other energy-based projects is that there's also a lot of jobs and opportunity, even in the development phase. Looking at that 5 to 7 year period before you get to FID, you're looking at spends of at least 200,000 or 200 million Australian dollars. So it's not a matter of long lead times, hoping you get to the opportunity after 5 to 7 years. There's a great amount of time, study and preparation, even around the procurement, getting long lead time items ready to go once you hit FID. Ensures that there's a lot of work from day one with offshore wind. Even looking at Star of the South, which we started in 2012 and welcomed CIP as investors in 2017, the spend over that period, particularly the last 4 years, it has been a really sharp increase, and that'll only continue further. Key challenge for Australia, being so far away, is trying to get the mobilisation of vessels and other equipment to Australia. That'll ensure that costs are always fairly high, and something that we need to work on throughout the supply chain. I'll get through really quickly just to show some pictures. These are, of course, are all on the Oceanex website. This is our own creation of a jelly map, we like to call it, just to give those who haven't really seen what an offshore wind farm looks like. This is basically it. We're very proud of this little image as well. It really outlines what the floating foundation looks like. Hydrogen will also be a key part of any discussion. Certainly talking with Llewelyn and team prior to today's webinar, certainly the opportunity we see in hydrogen is more in the near term around the commonality of supply chain and investors. When we're looking at projects of up to $10 billion CapEx, there are only a certain class of investors that get involved in those projects. It's very similar to hydrogen, where the numbers are at least $10 billion based on the size of projects we're looking at as well. So whilst there will be the opportunity to produce hydrogen with the involvement of offshore wind, we realistically see the costs as being a little bit prohibitive for quite a while, but we certainly see offshore wind as a great opportunity to accelerate hydrogen and also other industries like the electrification of transport. In Australia, we've done a lot of studies for Oceanex for all our projects. We're firmly into the feasibility phase, which we really entered at the start of this year. Probably the key studies that we've got there around the grid system capacity and availability. So we've worked with all our transmission network service providers here in the various states. Transgrid has obviously been a key partner of ours in confirming grid accessibility for all our projects. New Zealand were a little bit further behind. One thing I just wanted to capture in a quick snapshot, because I'm aware we've probably only got about 10 or so minutes left, is just around the timeline, just to show that offshore wind is not new to Australia. Sadly, I was one of the three, I usually say idiots, who's been looking at this for about 9 years. It's all looking like a great bit of foresight, but 9 years ago, it wasn't looking that pioneering at the time, but there's been a lot of work go in. I think we've got 13 bona fide projects that have been announced in the last 12 months. So this is not a new phenomenon, not only for Australia, but certainly not for our government. We first introduced offshore wind 6 years ago to Angus Taylor. Greg Hunt is the Environment Minister at the time as well. So the government have looked at this thoroughly. We've certainly been thankful to them for progressing it. Looking going forward, we've now got the legislation in place, so a lot of the real work will start from here. We think if Australia moves quickly, we've got a great opportunity to leapfrog a couple of real competitors in the region. Japan, South Korea and Taiwan are already 3 to 4 years ahead of us. But I think the onus is really on Australia now to set out the beacons like we've done with the legislation to say, come here, rather than looking at some other competitors like the Philippines, Thailand and Vietnam. So really encourage you, everyone, to reach out and speak to me. Llewelyn's been fantastic, the work that he's doing globally as well. So we've got a good base here in Australia. We just need to get moving on things. So my details are there. Please, everyone, feel free to reach out to me at any time.